Welcome to Beyond the Veil, where the darkness speaks and the unexplained finds its voice. This is the place where real fear lives quietly between the lines, where every story you hear could belong to someone you know or someone you are. On this channel, you will find long-form horror stories and shorts built from the kind of experiences that don't make sense in the daylight. Stories like The Black Book Graduates, The Dissertation of the Damned, and The Final Rites. Psychological, the kind that stay with you long after you stop listening. If you have not subscribed yet, do it now. Beyond the Veil. Introduction. Hollow Witness. I found the tape in a box my uncle left me when he died, and I almost threw it away because there was nothing written on it, just a strip of white masking tape along the spine with a single word pressed into it in blue ballpoint pen. The letters uneven, like whoever wrote it was pressing too hard, or maybe their hand was shaking, and the word was alone. All capitals, no punctuation, and I remember thinking that was a strange thing to write on a home videotape. Strange enough that I set it on the counter, instead of dropping it in the trash bag with the rest of the unlabeled junk from the box. And I went back to sorting through his things for another hour, before I found myself standing in front of it again, without really deciding to walk over there. Just suddenly present in front of it, the way you sometimes find yourself in a room with no memory of walking there. And my uncle had been a quiet man, the kind of person who accumulated things without explanation. Old radios that didn't work, maps of cities he'd never visited, 3 identical copies of the same novel about a man who survived something he refuses to describe. And so a tape labeled Alone felt consistent with who he was, felt like something he would keep. And I told myself that's why I held on to it. That's why I dug his old VHS player out of the second box and connected it to the television in the living room. And that's why I sat down on the floor in front of it at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night in October with the lights off, because the overhead bulb had burned out 2 days earlier, and I hadn't replaced it yet. And I pressed play. The first thing on the tape was static, not the loud crackling kind, but a soft gray hiss. The kind that feels almost like white noise, almost like rain on a window. And it lasted long enough that I thought maybe the tape was blank after all. Maybe the word on the spine meant something else entirely, or nothing at all. And then the image came through, and it was a room. Just a room. Filmed from a corner angle the way a security camera would sit. Wide enough to show most of the space, but with the edges soft and slightly distorted. And the room was a bedroom, small, with a single bed against the far wall. A wooden dresser, a window with the curtains drawn, a bedside lamp that was on and casting yellow light across the carpet. And the carpet was beige, and the walls were off-white, and there was nothing remarkable about any of it, except that there was a man sitting on the edge of the bed. And the man was my uncle. Younger than I had known him by maybe 15 or 20 years, but unmistakably. The same long jaw and slightly hunched posture, and the way he held his hands in his lap like he was waiting for something. And I remember the specific physical sensation of my chest going tight, because my uncle had been dead for 11 days, and here he was on a tape sitting in a room. I didn't recognize looking at something off camera that I couldn't see. He didn't speak for a long time. He just sat there with his hands in his lap and his eyes directed toward the left side of the frame. And whatever he was looking at was outside the camera's angle, and the lamp on the bedside table flickered once. A single brief interruption of the yellow light. And my uncle's eyes moved when it flickered, moved upward toward the ceiling for just a moment before returning to whatever was on the left side of the room. And I leaned closer to the television screen the way you do when you're trying to hear something better, even though what you need is your eyes, not your ears. And I was close enough to see that his hands in his lap were not still. His fingers were moving in a slow, repetitive pattern against his knee, pressing down in a sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. The way someone counts to stay calm. The way someone reminds themselves to breathe. And I recognize that because I do the same thing. I have done the same thing since I was a child. And nobody taught me that. It was just something my body learned to do. And seeing my uncle do it on a tape recorded years before I would have been old enough to show him made something cold settle into the space behind my sternum and stay there. Then he spoke. He didn't look at the camera when he did it. He kept his eyes on the left side of the room, and he said, very quietly, almost too quietly for the camera to pick up, but not quite, he said. It came back tonight, and then he was silent again, and the lamp flickered again. Twice this time in quick succession, and his fingers on his knee went 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. and I sat there on the floor of my living room with the television throwing pale light across my face. And I thought about the fact that someone had to have been filming this. Someone had to have been in the corner of that room, holding a camera or setting it up on something. And my uncle was talking to them, talking to whoever was behind the camera. And whoever that was had never appeared in the frame, and my uncle had never looked directly at them, not once. And I didn't know yet whether that detail was significant, but some part of me had already begun collecting details the way you do when something is wrong, and you don't fully know it yet, cataloging them without understanding why, storing them somewhere underneath the conscious level of your thinking. The tape kept going. My uncle sat on the edge of the bed, and the lamp threw yellow light across the room and outside the window. Behind the drawn curtains there was nothing audible. No traffic, no wind, no ambient sound that would tell me where this room was or what time it was or what season. And after another long silence, my uncle said, "I've been keeping track of it. I know its schedule now." And he reached over to the bedside table and picked up something that the camera was barely at the right angle to see. Something small and rectangular, a notebook, spiral-bound, the kind you buy at any drugstore. And he set it on his knee on top of his hands, and he didn't open it. He just held it there like it was important that it be in contact with his body. And I thought about the boxes from his house that I had been going through. 11 days of sorting through a dead man's accumulation. And I had found notebooks, several of them. But they had all been empty, every single one of them blank. And I had thought that was just another piece of the quiet strangeness of who my uncle was. A man who bought notebooks and never used them. But now I was watching him hold a notebook in a room I didn't recognize. And something about the empty notebooks in the boxes felt different. Felt like a different kind of information than it had 2 hours ago. He said, "The first night I documented it was March 14th. He said this still looking at the left side of the room. And he said, "Since then it has come back on the 8th, the 16th, the 23rd, and the 1st of the following month. And I want you to understand that I am not telling you this because I am afraid. I am telling you this because if something happens to this record, I need someone to have heard it spoken out loud." And he stopped, and the lamp flickered, and he pressed his fingers 1, 2, 3, 4 against the notebook instead of his knee. And he said, "It doesn't do anything. That's what took me so long to understand. It comes and it watches, and then it stops, and I never know when it's watching and when it's stopped. And I have spent 4 months trying to find the difference, and I have written down everything I've noticed in this book, every detail, every change. Because there are changes. They're small, but they're real. And the smallest of them is the one that convinced me this isn't something I invented." And then he looked directly at the camera for the first time. The shift was sudden enough that I actually moved backward on the floor, my hands pressing flat against the carpet behind me. Because there was something about the quality of his attention when he looked at the lens. Something that felt less like a man looking at a camera and more like a man looking through a window at a specific person. And he said the book was on the left side of the nightstand when I went to sleep and on the right side when I woke up, and I live alone. And he held my gaze through the television screen for another 3 seconds and then looked back at the left side of the room. And his fingers started their count again. 1, 2, 3, 4. I sat with that for a moment. I sat with the specific image of a notebook moved from one side of a nightstand to the other in a room where a man lived alone. And I thought about how that sounds like nothing. Sounds like the kind of thing a person does in their sleep and forgets. Sounds like the kind of evidence a rational mind dismisses in the morning. And I understood exactly why he had kept the notebook. Exactly why he needed the count and the documentation and someone to hear it spoken aloud. Because the things that happen to you in the night are the things that are easiest to talk yourself out of in the day. Not a fade, a hard cut, the image simply ending in gray static filling the screen for a moment before a new image began. And the new image was the same room, but different in the way a room looks different when the light has changed. The lamp was off now, and the only light was coming from somewhere off camera. Something with a bluer, colder quality than the lamp. And my uncle was in the same position on the edge of the bed, but his posture had changed. The slight hunch of his shoulders had become more pronounced, and his hands were not counting. Anymore, they were gripping the notebook, both hands wrapped around it, and the curtains on the window behind him were moving, just slightly. a slow rhythmic movement that looked less like a draft and more like breathing in and out, and there was no air conditioning unit visible, no vent near the window. The window, as far as I could tell, was closed. My uncle said, "I've been thinking about the nature of being watched, not the fact of it, the nature of it, what it means for something to direct its attention at you. Whether attention itself is a force, whether it lands on you the way light lands on something, whether you can feel it the way you can almost feel sunlight on your closed eyelids. I've been thinking about this because since March I have felt watched in a way that I could not explain until I stopped trying to explain it and started trying to describe it. And the description is this: it feels the same as being remembered, not observed, remembered. Like whatever this is, carries an image of me somewhere and returns to it, and the returning is what I feel. And I don't know if the difference matters, but it seems like it does. It seems like being remembered is something different from being watched, something that implies a relationship that watching alone doesn't require." He stopped. The curtains behind him continued their slow movement. The cold blue light held the room in something that felt less like darkness and more like the opposite of warmth. And my uncle looked at the left side of the room and then slowly turned his head to look at the right side of the room. And that was the first time he had looked right. The first time his attention had moved in that direction. And whatever he saw there, or whatever he believed was there, made his hands tighten on the notebook, the knuckles briefly pale before he turned back to center and said quietly, "I think there are two of them." I don't know how long I sat on the floor after that. The tape kept running. There were long stretches of my uncle sitting in the blue-lit room not speaking, just sitting, and I watched all of them. I couldn't make myself skip forward, because the silence felt like it contained something, felt like the kind of quiet that has a shape, and I was aware that I was in my own living room in the dark with a burned-out overhead bulb, and that the lamp I had on was on the other side of the room behind me. And at some point I became aware that I had not looked away from the television in a very long time, that my field of vision had narrowed to the screen and the pale rectangle of light it threw. And I did not know what was happening in the rest of the room behind me, and I was not looking. My uncle began speaking again. He said, "I'm going to tell you the rules I've established. I'm going to tell you what I've learned is safe, and what I've learned is not safe. And I want you to understand that I am not certain about any of this. I am working from pattern and probability, the same way you work out anything you can't study directly, the same way you infer the shape of something from the shadow it throws," he said. "Rule 1, do not look for it. Looking for it is different from seeing it incidentally. Looking for it is an invitation, and I don't fully understand the mechanism, but I have tested this enough times to be certain. On the nights when I actively searched the room, before sleep I was aware of it sooner, and for longer than on the nights when I kept my attention on something else. Rule 2, do not speak to it directly. I made this mistake once in the first week. I woke at what I estimated to be around 3 in the morning, with the specific sensation of being looked at, and I said, out loud, 'I know you're there,' and the room changed in a way I cannot describe precisely. Something about the air pressure, or the acoustic quality, or both. And nothing else happened that night, but the next documented occurrence was 2 days earlier than the pattern predicted, and it has maintained a slightly shorter interval since." He paused. He said, "This is the one I most want you to remember. Rule 3, if the notebook is moved, do not move it back." I stopped breathing for a moment. I replayed that in my head, the way you replay something when you heard it, but your mind needs a second pass to accept it. If the notebook is moved, do not move it back. I thought about that instruction. I thought about the specific nature of it, the way it implied not just that the notebook had been moved before, but that moving it back had produced a result, had caused something. And my uncle had not explained what that something was, had moved directly past it to the implicit warning, which was the more important part, which was the part he needed whoever was listening to retain. The tape cut again, same room. This time there was no lamp and no blue light. The room was in genuine darkness, and the camera was working in whatever low light capacity it had, rendering everything in that grainy gray-green quality that makes night vision footage feel like a different world. Like a world where familiar things have had their color removed and replaced with something that looks almost right, almost but not quite. My uncle was lying in the bed now on his back, on top of the covers, still dressed, and the notebook was on his chest, his hands flat on top it, and his eyes were open and directed at the ceiling, and he was doing the count, 1, 2, 3, 4, against the cover of the notebook, steady and rhythmic, and the room around him was quiet and gray-green and still. And then in the left side of the frame, where my uncle had been looking all night, where his attention had kept returning in the lit footage, something changed in the texture of the darkness. I want to be careful about how I describe this because I've thought about it many times since, and I don't want to overdress it, don't want to make it more than what it was, which was a change in the quality of the dark in one area of the frame, a slight shift in density, the kind of thing your eye catches and your brain works very quickly to assign a rational explanation for because that is what brains do. They move toward explanation the way water moves toward low ground, and my explanation was shadow. My explanation was that something outside the window had moved in front of whatever faint ambient light was coming through the curtains. A tree branch, a passing car, anything, but there were no curtains on this side of the room. I had been watching long enough to be certain the curtains were only on the window behind the bed, and this was the left side, the side my uncle had been watching all night. And the darkness there was different now, denser in a rough vertical shape that was not quite the shape of anything I wanted it to be the shape of. My uncle's counting stopped. His hands remained flat on the notebook, but the movement stopped, and his eyes stayed on the ceiling. And the room was absolutely silent in the way that rooms on tape are silent, with a faint layer of recording hiss underneath everything like a held breath. And the shape in the left side of the frame did not move, did not advance. Did nothing have to exist in the darkness with a particularity that made it impossible to look away from. And my uncle lay on the bed and did not look at it, which was the rule, which was the thing he had established through 4 months of documentation. And I was sitting on the floor of my living room, watching a dead man not look at something in the dark corner of a room in a tape rational framework for. That I had been not looking at something myself for the past several minutes, that my own attention had narrowed so completely to the screen, that I had been following his rule without knowing it was a rule, had been keeping my eyes forward without examining why. I did not turn around, I watched the tape. My uncle lay still with his hands on the notebook and his eyes on the ceiling for what my phone told me later was 43 minutes, and the shape in the left corner of the frame stayed for most of that. And at some point it was no longer there. I couldn't have told you exactly when it resolved back into ordinary darkness because it happened in the peripheral part of my attention the way things sometimes do, the way a sound stops and you only notice the silence it left. And eventually my uncle's hands resumed their count against the notebook, 1, 2, 3, 4. And something in his posture changed, something released. The difference between a man braced and a man breathing. And the tape ran for another few minutes and then cut to static. There was more on the tape. I need you to understand I did not know that at first. The static ran for long enough that I thought it was over, thought the tape had reached its end, and I sat there in the gray hiss of it for a while, processing. And then the image came back, and it was the same room but different again in the way the room kept being different. And this time my uncle was sitting on the floor instead of on the bed, sitting with his back against the side of the mattress and his knees pulled up and the notebook open in his lap. And he was writing, or he had been writing. The pen was in his hand, but it wasn't moving. And he was looking at the camera directly, had apparently been looking at it for some time before the tape resumed recording. And he looked tired in a way that went past physical. The kind of tired that is what long sustained attention to something frightening does to a person. The kind that settles into the face and stays. He said, I know you'll find this after I'm gone. I don't mean dead, I mean gone from this place. I've decided I'm leaving. I've been deciding for a long time and I've been staying because I needed to understand it first, needed to know what it is before I left it behind. But I've accepted now that I'm not going to understand it, that understanding it might not be available